Hi, welcome to Psychology 101. I'm Holly Chandler, your instructor. Let's start by figuring out what psychology is. Years ago, I gave an exam with a short answer question asking students that very question. What is psychology? And one student responded, it's everyone's major at some point during their college career. And they cited their source, of course, the Urban Dictionary. Well, I laughed when I read that, and I also thought that's probably true, although not the definition we're looking for. So let's try to drill into this and figure out what is psychology. This quote is from the last film in the Harry Potter series of films. Harry says after he dies, he says, "Is this in my mind or is this real?" And Dumbledore replies, "Of course it's in your mind, but that doesn't mean that it's not real." So, I want to introduce you to the history of psychology. We will look at the fields of study that led to psychology being established as a separate discipline, how it has changed over the years in terms of its orientation, and then we're going to come back around to this quote in the last Harry Potter film, where he says, "Is this in my mind or is this real?" Of course it's in your mind, but that does not mean it's not real. So today, the definition of psychology is simply this: the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. But psychologists did not realize this definition easily. Let's look at what led to this definition. The history of psychology. Around 300 BC, philosophers began asking questions such as, who are we? Where do our thoughts come from? Where do our feelings come from? And where do our actions come from? So we have a rich philosophical history. Aristotle, on the one hand, believed that the mind and the body are one, and they are not separate. This is called monism. He also believed that everything in the mind comes from the world through the senses. And Aristotle was the first to write about sleep, memory, dreams, senses, and learning. Then Plato came along, and in answering Aristotle, he believed that a person's character, traits, and intelligence are inherited, and that everything about a person was there the day that person was born. Plato also said that the mind and the body are separate entities. He believed that when a person's body dies, his soul does not die but continues on. This concept is called dualism. It means that the body and the mind are separate. So we had ongoing philosophical developments in this debate. René Descartes followed and promoted the doctrine called interactive dualism. This is the idea that the mind and the body are separate. However, they interact constantly to produce our conscious experience. So again, interactive dualism. The mind and the body are separate, but they interact continuously. Today, if you think about it, psychologists continue to debate the relationship between mental activity and the brain. So these early philosophers laid the groundwork for what we call today the nature-nurture debate. This is still the central issue in psychology. Let's drill into this a little bit more. So there are three perspectives to the nature-nurture debate. The first perspective is what we call the and perspective. Here we say you need genes and you need the environment to be a certain way. An example of this is musical ability. I, for example, can't sing to save my life, even though I do in my car. You must have some sort of a genetic component to be a good singer. However, if you never ever sing, you're not going to increase your skill in this way, and you're not going to be a good singer. If your environment doesn't expose you, for example, to what singing is, or even maybe singing lessons to get better. So in the and perspective, you need genes, the gene for musical ability and a good voice, and you need an environment that exposes you to song and that nurtures that. So that's the first perspective on the nature-nurture debate. The second is the via perspective. And here, what we say is that nature shows up via nurture. What I mean by this is something like how tall you are. So your height. Your height as an adult is determined by both your genes, which set the parameters, and by your environmental factors. For example, when my son was born, one of the first things that I asked the doctor was, how tall do you think he's going to be? And the doctor looked at me and looked at his dad, and also he took into account his birth weight, and he said, well, he's going to be between 5'10" and 6'2". And I thought, wow, well, that's a fairly big range. How come you can't be more specific? Well, because there are environmental factors that the doctor could not quantify. What are some of the environmental factors that impact how tall a child may grow to be? Well, environmental factors such as health, potentially exposure to disease, nutrition, those types of things will interact with the genetic propensity. So the third perspective is what we call 100% of both. Now this is an interesting perspective, and I want to explain this to you in depth. A study was completed not long ago in which researchers identified a gene for violence when they tested violent offenders. In other words, they did a genetic profile of violent offenders, and what they found is that all of them carried a specific gene. So they concluded that to be a violent felon, you must carry the gene for violence. The next step in the research then was to test the general population, and what they found, to their surprise, was that a small percentage of people in the general population who had not committed any sort of a violent crime also carried this gene. So what do you think is going on here? Well, what the researchers did then was they completed a very thorough psychosocial history, asking about these folks' early childhood experiences. And what they found is that the group of individuals who committed the violent crimes had been abused as children. The group of individuals that carried the gene but had not committed the crime had not been abused as individuals. So in this case, the implication is that the gene for violence was somehow switched on just as a light switch in your room is switched on when you flip it. So that gene was switched on by the environment. Now, I want to say that this does not mean that we know exactly all of the factors that contributed to switching on this gene. What we do know about abuse, for example, is that most individuals who have been abused as children do not go on to commit abuse, but about 30% do. So that's another factor to keep in mind in this nature versus nurture debate. So let's look at the foundations of modern psychology. About the 19th century, psychology formally separated from philosophy. However, influences from physiology still remain in the field of psychology, So what is physiology? Physiology is a subset of biology. It is the study of organisms, including the organs, tissues, and cells. Research conducted by physiologists led to the idea that scientific methods could be applied to human behavior and thinking. So this carries us forward to the 1800s in Germany. And I'd like to introduce you to Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt was a philosopher, and he was also a physiologist. So remember, that is a branch of biology. And Wundt wondered, how long does it take a person to be aware of being aware of something that happens to them? So, for example, do this. Pinch yourself. You feel it hurt. But is there a difference in the time when you feel it hurt and you have a conscious experience or awareness of that pain? Or consider this. If you accidentally touch the burner on a stove, your reflex is to pull your hand away. If you had waited until your mind caught up and confirmed, yeah, that really hurts, or maybe even, yeah, I smell burning flesh, right? That might be a little bit too long. So what Wundt was wondering was, is there a difference in time between how long it took you to pull your hand away and how long it took you to be aware of the fact that you pulled your hand away? Okay, so this is the very first psychological experiment that has ever been recorded in the history of psychology. So here's what Wundt did. He created a device that made a sound. And what he wanted to know was, how long did it take a person to perceive the sound? He found that it took 1/10 of a second to push a button when a sound occurred. But he also found that it took 2/10 of a second to push a button as soon as the person was consciously aware of perceiving that sound. So, that 1/10 of a second difference between when the person pushed the button and when they were aware of pushing the button was the first time anyone measured what we call a mental process. And so Wundt's profound contribution to psychology is that he emphasized the use of experimental methods to study and measure consciousness. Next, let's look at Edward Tishner. He was a student of Wundt, and he also then became a professor at Cornell University. Tishner introduced the concept of structuralism. Structuralism is the first major school of thought in psychology. It held that complex conscious experiences could be broken down into elemental structures of sensations and feelings. To identify these structures of conscious thought, Tishner trained his subjects in a procedure called introspection. Unfortunately, this procedure of introspection was deemed to be unreliable because it was based on the subjective experience of each individual person. And as we know, none of us are exactly the same in how we perceive or experience things. So because of the lack of objectivity in Tishner's procedure, the school of thought of introspection failed and is no longer alive today. So at this point, I'd like you to take a pause and review the content and any questions that you might have. And in the next video, we will pick up at this place.